Well, to put it pretty plainly, isn't it nice to have accountability back in the White House? Look, if you don't comply, get axed. This is how it should be. The Constitution is very, very clear that federal laws, such as Title IX, take precedence over state laws. I think the government of Maine is about to be reminded of that very soon in a manner that they won't like. And it's important to mention Maine received over $5.1 billion in federal funds last year. There's no way that a small state, I think the population is like 1.4, 1.5 million, and a very poor state at that,
Yeah.
can survive without federal funding. Same thing with Minnesota. They received, I think, about nearly $40 billion in federal grants. In California, they were $8 billion in federal grants just for education systems, kindergarten through 12th grade.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So as we know, Riley Gaines has continued to champion for women's sports. She was recently in Minnesota urging them to protect women's sports. Unfortunately, they chose differently. She has called out the NCAA for their policy change that doesn't quite go far enough in protecting girls from being in a locker room with boys, in ensuring that transgender athletes cannot still compete in women's categories. She's continuing to highlight the issue because we know, although we're grateful for the executive order, there are many states who are refusing to comply. There are many states who, incidentally, risk losing their federal funding, who are continuing to allow boys to compete against girls, to allow men into women's categories, ignoring the fact that the majority of people in this country, 80% of voters, are against allowing this to continue. They are insisting on ignoring the executive order. So you can imagine, despite the executive order, it's now more important than ever for women to speak out, for girls to refuse to compete against boys, for prominent figures in the public eye to speak out in support of female athletes. And Riley Gaines is calling on athletes who are currently at the top of their game, who are currently competing, because we know that we've seen a lot of former athletes or people who no longer compete who are speaking out. But what about current athletes? Athletes who are winning Olympic titles, athletes who are getting big deals, becoming more and more prominent, more and more famous, such as Caitlin Clark, Simone Biles, an icon in gymnastics. Riley Gaines is calling on them and questioned why they say nothing. So I'm curious to see what you think about this. I've seen people say, well, why they're going to rock the boat. They're currently competing. They don't want to get cancelled. They don't want to face a lot of backlash. They're focused on doing what they're doing. So why should they now disrupt everything and start taking on this cause? And then we have people who look at these athletes and assume that they're quite woke themselves. I know Simone Biles is not a fan of Trump, which, is not the end of the world in and of itself. But I get the impression that she leans left. However, generally speaking, Caitlin Clark, she stays out of politics. She has said that she doesn't want to comment on that, which is a very smart thing to do, I would say. There were some rumors about her boyfriend being a Democrat. I don't know. So we can't even assume that they're against transgender athletes competing in women's categories to begin with anyway, especially when it's something that they themselves don't have to deal with at the moment. Dawn Staley was asked about this topic, and she said that something along the lines of her not being against it per se.
Dan Zakrzewski, Outkick coach, you just talked about, what a massive weekend this is obviously for women's basketball, women's sports in general. One of the major issues facing women's sports right now is the discussion topic about the inclusion of transgender athletes, biological males, in women's sports. I was wondering if you would tell me your position on that issue.
Damn, you got deep on me, didn't you? I'm under the opinion of if you're a woman, you should play. If you consider yourself a woman and you want to play sports or vice versa, you should be able to play. That's my opinion. You want me to go deeper?
Do you think transgender women should be able to participate
That's your question
in
you
college
want
basketball.
me to ask. I mean, you want to ask, so I'll give you that. Yes. Yes. So now the barnstorm of people are going to flood my timeline and be a distraction to me on one of the biggest days of our game. And I'm okay with that. I really am.
Well, many people implied that she just gave the safe answer because, again, the backlash, the threat of being fired, of losing your role. We've seen what happened to Melissa Beatty-Smoos, who coaches college athletes. She got suspended and then she ended up losing her job permanently. There have been threats to her safety. Riley Gaines, where she was barricaded in a room for like 3 hours with crazy activists outside shouting and yelling and threatening her and extorting money. So athletes like Caitlin Clark, Caitlin is still essentially starting out her career and she doesn't know what tomorrow holds, what tomorrow brings. Simone Biles, already known as a legend, very successful, but she still has goals that she wants to achieve, I'm sure. So people will say, you know, why put this burden on them, so to speak? Let them concentrate on what they're doing in sports rather than getting into politics, because unfortunately this is a political issue now. So why put that onus on them to get into politics? Some people may argue that. So I'm curious to see what you think. So former NCAA swimmer and conservative influencer Riley Gaines has been one of the most active advocates of the movement, dating back to her infamous tie with transgender swimmer Leah Thomas at the 2022 NCAA Championships. In 2024, Gaines became the first brand ambassador for the activist sportswear brand XXXY Athletics. The brand gained prominence and profitability by becoming the first sportswear company dedicated to promoting activism against transgender inclusion in women's sports. It also created financial incentives for women's college athletes across the country to take a stand on the issue by signing with the brand. Gaines believes 2 stars can help propel the brand and movement to new heights. People who I think would be critical to this movement are, of course, people like Caitlin Clark, people like Simone Biles, which I think is definitely a stretch. But these are women who have been able to shatter glass ceilings and break barriers, who are role models to young girls across the country, Gaines told Fox News Digital in an exclusive interview. To have them emphatically say they, trans athletes, do not belong in women's sports the issue would be solved across all levels, like yesterday, if they were willing to do this. Gaines said it's not as far out of reach as it sounds due to a culture shift among Americans to protect women and girls from transgender athletes. Jennifer Say, XXXY founder, she was a gymnast and Levi executive. She addressed Gaines' pitch to Clark and Biles in a statement to Fox News Digital.
Over 600 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports. President Trump is going to try to put an end to this. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's an astonishing number. And to all the people who would say, oh, it's just a handful, it's not. I mean, those numbers are staggering. And I would argue one is too many. Why should a woman have to give up a trophy, a team berth, a medal to a man? It should never happen, not to mention her safety and her privacy in the locker room. So it's a thrilling day. I'm so honored to get to be there for the signing of this executive order. I started this brand 10 months ago to really attempt to change the culture and to get the 70% of Americans that agree with us, and that agree with biological reality that there are 2 sexes, to stand up and say so. And so this is just a huge moment.
So Jennifer, agreeing with Riley, released the following statement, saying we are always encouraging more female athletes to join the fight and would love to work with anyone standing up for the integrity of women's sports. We are in constant conversations with those who have stood up and are considering doing so. We believe this ends when the athletes defend women's sports in large numbers. So this brand is doing very well considering how new it is. The founder confirmed that it surpassed a 7-figure profit. But of course, the brand will benefit from having a big name to sponsor. Jennifer said there isn't a top-tier competitive female athlete or coach that has stood up for the protection of women's sports. We don't have any currently competing top-tier athletes who have spoken out. I think that's an illustration of how far we have to go. It should be normal for them to stand up and say, I will fight for the protection of women's sports. And yet they haven't, because I think a lot of them are afraid of being called terrible names. Exactly. She said that it's in the works and there are conversations with many amazing athletes, Olympians and beyond. So that's exciting. And I think having a big name to sponsor would be huge for this brand and its message. And as Jennifer said, the culture has changed. The culture has shifted. The polls, the surveys all reflect that. But it's a matter of whether it's shifted enough for these female athletes to feel comfortable, because many of them will see it as making a political statement. And if you're okay talking about white privilege and racial issues, then yeah, maybe you should be okay with speaking about women's sports and defending women's sports and why you personally don't want to compete against a man. So what do you think? Do you think big name athletes need to start speaking out now, especially as there is a culture shift? Or do you think the culture hasn't shifted far enough? But when it comes to sponsorships now, that is a very big risk to be taken, because more than likely they will be afraid of losing their sponsorships, especially because a lot of these companies are woke, like Nike, for example. We've seen what they've supported in the past. They've supported Dylan Mulvaney, for example, using Dylan Mulvaney in women's campaigns, advertising sports bras. Caitlin Clark, isn't she a spokesperson for Nike? So you can see the conflict here. But it would have a big impact, it really would, if someone like Caitlin Clark did speak out, if someone like Simone Biles did speak out. To Jennifer Say, she's tagging some female athletes here. She said, standing with Riley Gaines and calling on female athletes to stand up for the protection of women's sports. At Serena Williams, in 2023, you said you'd lose to Andy Murray in 5 minutes. We need your voice. Unfortunately, her husband has invested in the sports bra, which is a bar that showcases women's sports. Sounds great. But then they showed their support for a transgender athlete who won a state championship, who stole a state championship from a female athlete over in Portland. So I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. Alex Morgan, post-retirement, you say you want to invest in women's sports. Why not start by standing up to protect women's sports? And then Nelly Corder and Caitlin Clark, go Sid go. She said, the list goes on. Join us. Your silence is deafening. Use your voice to help girls and women and to protect XX sports. You know that XYs impact the safety and sanctity of female sports and spaces. Caitlin Clark is barely out of teenage years. Stop asking people who are minding their own business to get into movements. Seriously, stop it. Caitlin Clark plays in my state. She'll never do that. She's a phenomenal basketball player, but she doesn't have enough backbone. You'll never get Caitlin, and the chance of Simone are less than never. She's spoken out against Trump during the election campaign. Where are the female athletes? We need more to stand up. I agree with that. So let me know what you think. Do you think that we should put ourselves in their position and think about what we would do if we were them? Would we be so willing to potentially lose big sponsorship deals, lose fans, receive a lot of backlash? So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like, comment and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.